Andrew Parker Bowles didn't ask for an appointment. He simply walked into a private, heavily guarded drawing room at Buckingham Palace, sat directly across from Princess Anne, and slid a single, unmarked folder across the mahogany table. Without a tremor in his voice, he looked the king's sister dead in the eye and stated that Queen Camilla had been running a massive, untraceable financial empire behind the family's back for over 2 years. If the figures inside that folder leaked to the press, it wouldn't just ruin a marriage, it would instantly collapse the financial integrity of the modern monarchy. He didn't say how he acquired the ledgers. He deliberately left out why a financially ruined ex-husband was suddenly playing the role of a royal whistleblower in the middle of a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The very shield built to protect a queen was about to become the weapon that dethroned her. Before we uncover exactly how this shadow empire was constructed and the fatal mistake that brought it down, make sure to subscribe to Royal Signal so you don't miss a single piece of this unprecedented investigation. Princess Anne didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. And she didn't reach for the phone to alert King Charles. She knew rigid royal protocol dictated she have security remove him immediately for bypassing her diary management. But Anne is nothing if not pragmatic. She simply held his desperate gaze, pulled the folder closer, and opened the cover to look at the destruction inside. To understand the sheer magnitude of what was happening in that room, you have to understand exactly who Andrew Parker Bowles had become by that rainy Tuesday. He wasn't sitting across from Princess Anne as a concerned citizen, a moral crusader, or a loyal servant to the crown. He was sitting there as a desperate, cornered man. As Anne scanned the initial pages of the unverified folder, Andrew didn't try to dress up his motives with false nobility. He leaned forward and laid his cards on the table. His private investment firm was collapsing. A series of disastrous real estate ventures and plunging stock portfolios had left him completely underwater. He was drowning in debt, the specific kind of debt that inevitably attracts ruthless creditors and, shortly after, the merciless front pages of the British tabloids. Andrew was banking on a very specific, deeply hidden institutional reality. There is a long, highly classified history of the palace quietly absorbing the debts of extended royal affiliates. For decades, the firm has preferred to silently settle embarrassing financial disasters rather than let them become public spectacles that tarnish the monarchy by association. Andrew wasn't just dropping off a tip about his ex-wife. He was attempting a high-stakes trade. He was offering the palace the chance to contain a massive, catastrophic scandal in exchange for the ultimate royal bailout. He looked at Anne and made his position crystal clear. If this shadow network was exposed by an outside entity, the blowback wouldn't just destroy Camilla, it would shatter the public's fragile trust in the sovereign grant. He was offering them a head start to control the narrative, provided the palace erased his financial ruin first. This is the exact moment the tension in the room peaked. Princess Anne had to make a split-second psychological assessment. Was she dealing with a genuine whistleblower who had stumbled onto a sophisticated financial betrayal? Or was she looking at a drowning extortionist willing to fabricate ledgers to blackmail the crown? Anne's response is exactly why she is considered the most formidable, unshakable force within the royal family. She didn't negotiate, she didn't express outrage, and she certainly didn't offer him a single penny from the royal coffers. With cold, absolute authority, she told Andrew that she would retain the folder. She would investigate the claims internally, and only if she found undeniable, empirical proof of a breach would she decide on a course of action. She promised him absolutely nothing. No protection, no money, no immunity. She formally dismissed him. Andrew left the room with his shoulders slumped, his final, desperate gamble having seemingly failed. He had surrendered his only leverage and walked away empty-handed. But the moment the heavy doors clicked shut behind him, Anne's stoic demeanor vanished. She didn't call her trusted aides. She didn't alert the king. Instead, she walked over to the double doors of her private office and turned the lock. She switched her phone to silent, placed it face down on the desk, and pulled out the highly confidential royal expenditure ledgers. She was about to find out exactly how deep the rot actually went. The digital clock on the mahogany desk clicked past midnight as Princess Anne continued her solitary audit. The task before her was monumentally sensitive. She was looking for anomalies in the very accounts meant to represent the crown's public goodwill. In the official, public-facing ledgers, everything looked impeccably pristine. Millions of pounds were meticulously tracked under standard royal expenditure categories: community development grants, international charitable funds, and standard venue maintenance for royal engagement. But Anne had managed royal projects for decades. She knew what legitimate bureaucracy looked like, and she knew what a deliberate cover-up looked like. When she began cross-referencing the internal transaction logs against the official partner registries, the first major discrepancy emerged. A massive £2 million allocation, ostensibly earmarked for an educational development initiative in the Commonwealth, had been dispersed from a royal foundation. However, instead of going directly to the educational providers, the funds had been routed through 3 entirely separate corporate entities within a single 30-day window. The names on the digital transfers were completely unfamiliar to the Palace Procurement Office. Horizon Partners and Royal Legacy Holdings. They were private enterprises, completely absent from any official royal supplier lists. Yet they were receiving massive influxes of capital, only to pass them along immediately to the next layer. This wasn't a case of sloppy bookkeeping or administrative incompetence. This was highly sophisticated financial structuring, a deliberate attempt to create a labyrinth that would exhaust any casual auditor. Recognizing the constitutional danger of what she was uncovering, Anne refused to use the standard palace auditing staff. If word leaked that the Princess Royal was digging into the Queen Consort's financial management, it would trigger an immediate... Instead, she formed a highly covert, 3-person task force that existed completely outside the official palace grid. She summoned 3 individuals whose absolute loyalty to the crown was beyond question. A brilliant, retired forensic accountant who had spent 30 years auditing the Duchy of Cornwall, a discreet, trusted royal solicitor specializing in private corporate law, and her most loyal personal assistant. Meeting in the absolute secrecy of her private quarters under the cover of night, Anne looked each of them in the eye. She made the stakes chillingly clear. They were to initiate a completely off-the-books investigation into every single fund, charity, and commercial partnership overseen by Queen Camilla over the last 2.5 years. No other members of the royal family were to be notified, not even King Charles. Their mandate was simple yet terrifying: trace the ultimate destination of the money flowing through the intermediary companies, verify the true identities of the corporate directors, and uncover the exact nature of Camilla's involvement. The retired financial expert immediately recognized the danger. As he reviewed the preliminary 3-layer transaction map Anne had scribbled out, his face grew pale. He leaned over the desk and delivered a stark, professional warning. To uncover the true beneficial owners behind these anonymous holding companies, they would have to pierce corporate veils that were heavily protected by private banking laws. If they pushed too hard and their unauthorized intrusion was detected by the network's handlers, it wouldn't just be a family scandal. It would trigger a catastrophic institutional crisis that could fundamentally challenge the integrity of the sovereign grant itself. Anne didn't hesitate. She looked at the expert, her expression hard as flint, and ordered him to break through the firewall anyway. The investigation was officially live, and there was no turning back. To understand how a reigning queen consort could justify constructing a multi-million-pound shadow empire behind the back of the very institution she represented, you have to look past the crown and examine the scars beneath it. To the public, Camilla's ascent from royal outcast to queen consort looked like the ultimate triumph of patience. But psychologically, those early brutal decades left an indelible mark. When she first stepped into the grueling machinery of the palace, she was arguably the most vilified woman in Britain. She was surrounded by a public that despised her and an internal royal household that viewed her with deep, barely concealed suspicion. She had watched the firm close ranks before. She knew better than anyone how swiftly the institution could sever ties and discard those it deemed a liability. Even as she reached the ultimate pinnacle of royal power, that deep-seated paranoia never fully dissipated. What if public opinion violently turned again? What if she outlived the king, and the new monarch decided to quietly exile her from the inner circle? She needed a guarantee. She needed an insurance policy, a fortified financial bunker that no one, not even the sovereign, could touch. But building a covert financial network while living inside the most scrutinized family on earth presents an almost impossible logistical challenge. She couldn't use standard royal aides or private secretaries. Courtiers are notoriously loyal to the crown first and the individual second. To build her empire, she had to rely on the invisible men of the monarchy. Within the royal ecosystem, there is a strict, unspoken hierarchy. At the very edge of that hierarchy are the royal protection officers. These highly trained, elite bodyguards occupy a unique, contradictory space. They are physically closer to the royals than anyone else, present for every private argument, secret meeting, and vulnerable moment, yet they are culturally invisible. They are trained to blend into the wallpaper. Camilla realized that her former security detail, men who had shielded her during the most hostile years of her life, possessed a fierce, unbreakable loyalty to her personally rather than to the institution. They became the perfect, untraceable assets. Bypassing the official palace grid, she recruited her most trusted former bodyguards to serve as the corporate fronts for her shadow network. On paper, these men became the sole directors of entities like Horizon Partners. Under Camilla's quiet direction, these companies began offering strategic consulting and facilitation services for royal charities and foreign development projects. They legally siphoned percentages of massive royal contracts, transforming her legitimate proximity to the throne into a covert mechanism for generating untraceable personal wealth. It is a chilling realization, but it forces a moment of profound empathy. This sprawling corruption wasn't born out of cartoonish greed. It was the desperate, calculated architecture of a woman who had been traumatized by her past and was terrified of her future. She built a fortress out of fear. By the end of its second year, the network was flawless. The corporate directors were absolute loyalists. The offshore accounts were heavily encrypted, and the paper trail was seemingly impenetrable from the outside. Camilla had successfully insulated herself against any institutional threat. But as Princess Anne's covert task force was about to discover, the greatest threat to Camilla's fortress didn't come from an outside attack. It was about to come from the inside, triggered by a careless, late-night clerical error, by a low-level staffer who was never supposed to see the files at all. The irony of impenetrable fortresses is that they are rarely breached by a frontal assault. They fall because someone forgets to lock a side door. In the labyrinthine world of the British monarchy, that side door was a man named Richard. To understand how Richard inadvertently detonated this crisis, one must understand the peculiar administrative infrastructure that connects current and former royal households. When a royal marriage ends, the logistical ties do not immediately sever. Pension protocols, shared historical trusts, and old estate managements often require a quiet, overlapping bureaucracy. Richard was a low-level, meticulously discreet secretary whose duties required him to navigate this gray zone, occasionally handling mundane paperwork for both Queen Camilla's outer administrative circle and the legacy files of Andrew Parker Bowles. Late one November evening, while reorganizing a backlog of misfiled documents in a secure archive room at Clarence House, Richard found a misplaced folio. It wasn't marked classified, but the moment he opened it, he knew he was holding live ammunition. Inside were heavily redacted ownership transfer documents and complex transaction logs, detailing massive money flows into private entities like Horizon Partners. The files clearly linked the offshore companies to Camilla's most trusted former bodyguards. Richard wasn't a forensic accountant, but he didn't need to be to recognize the anatomy of a shadow empire. Terrified by the sheer scale of what he had uncovered, Richard did what any survivor in the royal ecosystem would do. He buried the file at the bottom of a locked cabinet, determined to take the secret to his grave. He knew firsthand the crushing power of the palace machine and had absolutely no intention of becoming collateral damage in a royal scandal. But secrets that carry that much psychological weight are incredibly difficult to hold silently. Months later, Richard was tasked with a routine, private meeting with Andrew Parker Bowles to finalize some lingering legacy estate paperwork. Andrew was already in the throes of his financial collapse, stressed, erratic, and aggressively pressing Richard about every available penny in his old trusts. Exhausted and desperate to deflect Andrew's relentless questioning, Richard made a fatal, split-second error. Trying to explain a delay in funding approvals, he vaguely referenced the new corporate entities protecting the Queen's interests. The moment the words left his mouth, the temperature in the room dropped. Andrew Parker Bowles might have been a failing investor, but he was a survivor of decades of royal maneuvering. He instantly recognized a discrepancy. The Queen Consort shouldn't have private corporate entities protecting her financial interests outside the sovereign grant. Like a starving predator smelling blood, Andrew relentlessly pressed the terrified secretary. He cornered Richard, manipulating his fear and extracting just enough fragmented details, names of the bodyguards, the scale of the money flows, the existence of the offshore holding companies to piece together the horrifying reality. His ex-wife was sitting on an untraceable fortune, while he was facing absolute ruin. Armed with this explosive intelligence, Andrew didn't go to the press. He went straight to the source. He bypassed the official royal diary and secured a deeply private, face-to-face confrontation with Camilla in her private sitting room. The dynamic between them was instantly volatile. Andrew, desperate and sweating, laid out exactly what he knew. He threatened to expose the entire shadow network to the British media unless she immediately transferred a massive sum to quietly save his collapsing firm. He thought he had the ultimate leverage. He thought he had trapped her. He was wrong. Camilla didn't panic. She didn't apologize, and she certainly didn't negotiate. Leaning back in her chair, She looked at the desperate man before her and simply laughed. Her response was a masterpiece of cold, calculated dominance. She told him he had absolutely no right to interfere in her survival. She dared him to go to the press, asking him with razor-sharp cruelty, who exactly did he think the British public and King Charles would believe? A deeply indebted, desperate ex-husband known for failed investments? Or the reigning queen consort of the United Kingdom? Defeated and humiliated, Andrew stormed out of the room, realizing his blackmail attempt had spectacularly failed. As he walked away, Camilla maintained her mask of impenetrable amusement. But the absolute second the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind him, her smile vanished. Her eyes hardened into a look of absolute, terrifying clarity. Andrew was reckless, and a reckless man with nothing left to lose was a catastrophic liability. She immediately reached for a secure line, ready to initiate a devastating, scorched earth protocol. The retired financial expert had spent 30 years auditing the Duchy of Cornwall, untangling some of the most complex aristocratic trusts and legacy estates in Europe. He was a man who believed that numbers never lied and that every stolen pound eventually left a footprint. But as he sat in Princess Anne's dimly lit, off-the-books war room, staring at the transaction maps spread across the mahogany table, he felt a creeping, icy sense of defeat. He had finally hit the wall. Initially, the covert task force had made terrifyingly rapid progress. Just as the fragmented intelligence suggested, they had successfully pierced the first layer of the shadow network. They identified the corporate directors of Horizon Partners and Royal Legacy Holdings, confirming they were, in fact, Queen Camilla's most fiercely loyal former protection officers. It was a massive breakthrough. But finding the names of the frontmen was the easy part. Following the actual capital was where the forensic nightmare truly began. To understand why the investigation stalled, you have to understand the excruciating legal complexities of crown entities interacting with offshore tax havens. Domestically, royal finances are subject to rigorous, unyielding scrutiny. But Camilla's network didn't keep the money in Britain. The expert discovered that the moment the funds passed through the bodyguard's front companies, they were instantly wired into a sprawling web of anonymous overseas holding companies in jurisdictions completely immune to British financial law. This is the ultimate jurisdictional nightmare for the palace. The British Crown cannot legally compel the unmasking of beneficial owners in sovereign tax havens without formally involving international financial authorities. And the moment Princess Anne requested an international subpoena, the completely secret investigation would become a matter of public, global record. The monarchy would be dragged into an international money laundering probe. Camilla had brilliantly weaponized the palace's own need for secrecy against them. And then, things got exponentially worse. As the expert dug desperately for a domestic mistake, he realized the digital paper trail was actively dissolving right in front of his eyes. Because of Andrew Parker Bowles's reckless confrontation, Camilla had already initiated her countermeasures. Server logs were being wiped. Accounting records from 2 years ago were abruptly altered, and flawlessly disguised retrospective invoices began appearing in the system to justify the massive cash outflows. The expert realized with a sinking stomach that they had been completely outplayed. He gathered his files, walked into Princess Anne's private office, and delivered the bitter truth. He told the king's sister that the financial audit was dead, Camilla's offshore firewall was impenetrable, and the remaining domestic documents had been expertly sanitized. He looked Anne in the eye and stated plainly that paper would never convict the queen consort. Any discrepancy could easily be written off by highly paid lawyers as a clerical error by overzealous subordinates. For a long moment, Princess Anne said absolutely nothing. She simply stared out the window at the rain-slicked London streets. Then, the frustration in the room suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold, high-stakes thrill. Anne realized that if the paper was protected, they had to break the humans guarding it. They needed a confession. The Princess Royal immediately shifted the entire nature of the operation. She was no longer running a financial audit. She was initiating an active espionage sting. To bypass Camilla's firewall, Anne deployed her most dangerous, tightly held asset, a former elite royal security officer who operated entirely in the shadows. This was a man who spoke the exact same language of loyalty and threat as Camilla's inner circle. He was tasked with one impossible mission: make direct contact with Edward, the ex-bodyguard who served as Camilla's primary fixer and the absolute linchpin of her shadow empire, operating under the guise of an incredibly lucrative business cooperation regarding a Middle Eastern real estate venture. Anne's operative reached out. To the task force's surprise, Edward didn't hang up. A meeting was arranged. The trap was officially set, but the danger was catastrophic. The rendezvous was scheduled for the following afternoon in a quiet, secluded corporate office in the London suburbs. Edward was highly trained in counter-surveillance, naturally paranoid, and fiercely protective of the Queen Consort. If Anne's operative pushed too hard, asked the wrong question, or made a single microscopic slip in his cover story, Edward would instantly realize it was a setup. And the second he did, Camilla would know that Princess Anne was hunting her. The nondescript, short-term rental office in the quiet London suburbs was chosen for a very specific reason. It was entirely off the royal grid. There were no palace courtiers, no armed guards, and no royal standard flying above the door. It was a sterile, utterly forgettable corporate space, making it the perfect battleground for a psychological war between two men who were trained never to lose. When Princess Anne's operative walked into the room, Edward was already seated. To the untrained eye, Edward looked like a standard corporate director in a tailored suit, but the operative knew exactly who he was dealing with. Edward was a former elite royal protection officer. He was a man who had spent years scanning crowds for assassins, anticipating threats before they materialized, and acting as the ultimate physical and legal shield for Queen Camilla. More importantly, Edward was bound by the most terrifying legal constraints in the British establishment. Former royal security personnel are locked into ironclad non-disclosure agreements and the Official Secrets Act. Breaching these agreements doesn't just result in termination. It guarantees absolute financial ruin, total excommunication from the global private security sector, and potentially devastating legal prosecution. Edward's silence wasn't just a matter of loyalty, it was a matter of survival. The operative sat down, adopting the relaxed, confident posture of a wealthy intermediary. He launched into his cover story, pitching a highly lucrative, vaguely defined real estate development project in the Middle East. He explained that his investors were looking for discreet facilitation and strategic partnership through Horizon Partners. He carefully dangled the bait, implying that a connection to royal prestige could result in a massive financial windfall for both sides. He waited for Edward to take the bait, to show even a flicker of greed or acknowledgement of his hidden royal backing. Edward gave him absolutely nothing. The former bodyguard took a slow sip of water, his hands completely steady, his face an impenetrable mask of polite corporate indifference. He smiled coldly and stated that there seemed to be a misunderstanding. He claimed Horizon Partners was a straightforward, fully transparent consultancy firm. He seamlessly deflected every subtle implication of hidden money or royal connections, offering nothing but corporate jargon. If the operative's investors had a legitimate proposal, Edward suggested, they were welcome to submit it to a generic company email address for standard review. The operative felt the icy chill of the stone wall. He knew instantly that Edward was too disciplined to crack in a first meeting. If the operative pushed any harder, if he tried to force the issue, or ask a leading question, Edward's counter-surveillance instincts would instantly trigger. Edward would know he was being stung, and the entire investigation would collapse. So, the operative made a brilliant tactical retreat. He didn't push. Instead, he let his shoulders drop, allowing a flicker of genuine annoyance to cross his face. He masterfully feigned the bruised ego of a wealthy businessman whose time had just been wasted. He closed his briefcase with a sharp, dismissive snap and stood up, apologizing curtly for the misunderstanding. He had lost the verbal battle, but the conversation was never the actual mission. As the operative prepared to leave, he reached his right hand across the wide mahogany table to offer a final, professional handshake. He locked his eyes directly onto Edward's. It is a fundamental psychological trick. Intense, unwavering eye contact forces the human brain to focus entirely on the face and the extended hand. While Edward's intense scrutiny was locked on the operative's eyes and their gripping right hands, the operative's left hand completely obscured by the drape of his coat, and the shadow of the desk moved with blinding speed. He pressed a microscopic, military-grade, voice-activated recording device firmly against the underside of the table. The handshake broke. The operative turned and walked out of the room, leaving Edward completely unaware that the dynamic of the entire crisis had just shifted. To the CCTV cameras outside, the operative looked like a defeated man walking back to his car in the rain. But as he sent a secure ping to Princess Anne's encrypted phone, a surge of adrenaline masked his quiet triumph. The bug was live. The trap was successfully armed. But as Princess Anne received the signal in her locked office, she knew they were now relying on a terrifyingly massive gamble. The device was planted in Edward's territory, but Edward wasn't the ultimate target. For this trap to actually work, they needed the Queen Consort herself to feel so panicked, so utterly desperate to control the fallout, that she would abandon the heavily fortified walls of Clarence House and walked directly into that exact suburban room. The internal security apparatus of Clarence House is arguably the most sophisticated private intelligence network in London. A reigning queen consort is never truly in the dark. She is insulated by a web of loyalists, informants, and highly trained security personnel who monitor every ripple in the royal ecosystem. Within hours of the operative leaving the suburban office, Edward sent a secure, encrypted message to Camilla's inner circle. He reported the strange, vaguely threatening meeting with the so-called Middle Eastern investor. Edward hadn't cracked, but he was a seasoned professional. He knew a probing operation when he saw one. When the intelligence reached Camilla, she didn't panic. Panic is a luxury for those who haven't spent decades surviving the brutal, behind-the-scenes warfare of the British monarchy. She instantly recognized the signature of the operation. This wasn't a tabloid journalist digging for a scoop, and it certainly wasn't a random corporate spy. This was the calculated, surgical precision of Princess Anne. Camilla knew her sister-in-law was closing in, and she knew the paper trail alone wouldn't be enough to trigger a sting like this. Anne was looking for the kill shot, a human confession. Instead of retreating or going into hiding, Camilla decided to launch a devastating counterattack. But to execute it, she had to do something incredibly dangerous. She had to move her operations completely off the official royal grid. Escaping the palace diary is nearly impossible for a queen consort. Every movement, every visitor, and every phone call is meticulously logged by a small army of courtiers whose sole job is to track the sovereign and his wife. To bypass this suffocating surveillance, Camilla utilized a ghost protocol, a highly classified, unofficial maneuver typically reserved for extreme security threats. Utilizing her most fiercely loyal protection officers, she was quietly slipped out through a subterranean service exit into an unmarked, civilian decoy vehicle. While the official royal motorcade proceeded to a scheduled, highly visible engagement to maintain appearances, Camilla traveled incognito through the rain-slicked streets of London. She was heading directly toward the very place Anne's operative had just vacated, the secluded suburban office. When Camilla walked into the sterile, short-term rental space, Edward was waiting. The atmosphere was thick with tension, but Camilla was a vision of absolute, chilling composure. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Pacing the floor with the authority of a military commander, she began issuing rapid-fire, ruthless orders to dismantle the empire she had spent 2 years building. She ordered Edward to execute a total digital blackout. Every server log linking her to Horizon Partners was to be wiped using military-grade data destruction software. Every physical file was to be incinerated. Every offshore account was to be instantly decentralized and hidden behind new layers of anonymous proxies. But destroying the evidence wasn't enough for Camilla. She knew that a sudden disappearance of funds would only confirm Anne's suspicions. She needed a narrative. She needed a scapegoat, and in a masterstroke of diabolical brilliance, she chose the man who had just tried to blackmail her. Camilla ordered the creation of a massive, meticulously forged paper trail designed to frame Andrew Parker Bowles as the sole mastermind behind the entire shadow network. She instructed Edward to backdate internal memorandums, falsify corporate signatures on offshore transfer documents, and manipulate the Foundation's transaction logs to make it look as though Andrew had independently exploited her past royal connections. She dictated the exact narrative they would feed the investigators. Andrew, desperate and facing bankruptcy, had gone rogue. She was going to use Andrew's current, highly publicized financial ruin as the perfect, undeniable motive for his imaginary crimes. If Anne wanted a culprit, Camilla was going to hand her Andrew's head on a silver platter. As she laid out the intricate details of this ruthless setup, her strategic brilliance was undeniable. She had anticipated every angle, closed every loophole, and effortlessly weaponized the palace's own legal structures to insulate herself while destroying her ex-husband. But this is where the sheer, breathtaking dramatic irony of the situation reaches its peak. As Camilla stood in that quiet room, confidently dictating the destruction of a man's life and the manipulation of the crown, she had no idea that she was speaking directly into Princess Anne's trap. Every cold command, every detail of the forgery, every remorseless syllable was being captured in crystal-clear high definition by the voice-activated device planted just inches away from her. Believing her fortress was completely secure and her enemies outmaneuvered, Camilla offered a final, satisfied smile. She told Edward to execute the plan by midnight, turned on her heel, and walked out of the room to return to her throne. She left completely unaware that underneath the mahogany table, A tiny red light was silently, steadily blinking. The storm over London hadn't broken by the time the encrypted audio file finally arrived on Princess Anne's secure terminal. Sitting in the oppressive silence of her private office, illuminated only by the harsh glow of her desk lamp, she connected her earpiece and pressed play. What she heard over the next 20 minutes was not the sound of a terrified woman making a desperate mistake. It was the sound of a seasoned tactician orchestrating a slaughter. Camilla's voice echoed in the quiet room with crystal-clear fidelity. Anne listened as her sister-in-law rapidly commanded the destruction of digital servers, the burning of ledgers, and the decentralization of offshore accounts. But the true horror, the element that made Anne's blood run cold, was the chilling, remorseless tone with which Camilla ordered the forgery of documents to frame Andrew Parker Bowles. There was no hesitation in the Queen Consort's voice, no flicker of moral conflict. She was casually, efficiently directing the complete annihilation of a man's reputation and freedom to save her own skin. For Anne, this was the absolute turning point. The financial corruption was a grievous violation, but it was born of a recognizable paranoia. This, however, was something entirely different. This was an active, malignant willingness to destroy innocent lives and weaponize the legal apparatus of the crown. If Camilla was willing to cross this line, there was no limit to the damage she could inflict upon the institution itself. The Princess Royal disconnected the earpiece. The time for covert task forces and strategic waiting was over. Anne reached for the secure red telephone on her desk. She was about to do something that is almost never done in the modern era. Within the rigid constitutional protocols of the British monarchy, a reigning sovereign is only woken in the middle of the night for 3 specific reasons: a declaration of war, a catastrophic state emergency, or the death of a senior royal. Standard procedure dictates that even urgent matters must wait for the morning box, filtered through the king's private secretary. But Anne didn't call the private secretary. Invoking her unique, unassailable position as the Princess Royal and the king's sister, she bypassed the entire bureaucratic shield of the palace. She contacted the king's personal page directly, issuing a code that denoted a supreme familial emergency. Charles was to be woken immediately. Carrying a single digital drive containing the audio file, Anne walked through the cavernous, silent corridors of Buckingham Palace. The weight of what she was about to do pressed heavily on her shoulders. She wasn't just bringing evidence of a crime. She was bringing the weapon that would break her brother's heart. She knew how deeply Charles loved Camilla, how hard he had fought the establishment and the public to place the crown on her head. Anne was walking into that room to shatter his world, but her duty to the crown superseded her empathy for her brother. When Anne entered the small, private sitting room deep within the sovereign's apartments, King Charles was already there. He sat at a small circular table, looking impossibly fragile and exhausted, hastily dressed in informal attire, his face etched with worry over the midnight summons. Anne did not sit. She placed the digital drive on the table between them and looked at the sovereign. Before she could even begin to explain the devastating reality of what was on that tape, the heavy wooden door clicked open. Camilla, summoned from her own chambers, stepped into the room. The trap had officially snapped shut, and there was absolutely nowhere left to run. The atmosphere in the king's private sitting room was suffocating. Queen Camilla stood near the doorway, pulling her robe tighter around herself, her eyes darting between the exhausted monarch and the unyielding Princess Royal. Princess Anne did not waste time. With surgical precision, she laid out the accusations: the hidden financial network, the offshore accounts, the exploitation of royal proxies. Camilla reacted immediately, launching into a fierce, indignant denial. She turned to King Charles, her voice trembling with manufactured betrayal. She insisted that this was all a monstrous fabrication, orchestrated by a bankrupt, desperate Andrew Parker Bowles. She pleaded with her husband, leaning heavily on the decades of public abuse they had endured together, framing herself as the victim of yet another vicious smear campaign. She begged Charles to protect her. Charles looked torn, his eyes reflecting the agony of a man desperate to believe the woman he loved. Anne didn't argue. She simply connected the digital drive to a small, secure terminal on the desk and pressed play. The pristine, digitized audio of Camilla's own voice filled the silent room. There was no static to hide behind. Every cold, calculating instruction to Edward, the orders to wipe the servers, burn the files, and meticulously forge documents to destroy her ex-husband echoed off the palace walls. As the recording played, all the color drained from Camilla's face. The impenetrable mask of the Queen Consort shattered completely. When the audio finally clicked off, the silence that followed was deafening. Camilla tried to speak, but the lie was dead. Desperate, she shifted tactics, tears welling in her eyes as she cited her historical mistreatment. She pleaded that the firm had never truly accepted her, that she had to build a failsafe because she was terrified of being abandoned. But Charles was no longer looking at his wife. He was looking at a stranger. The financial theft was a deep wound, but the ruthless, calculated attempt to frame another human being and the effortless way she had just lied to his face was a fatal blow to their foundation. Speaking with the absolute, chilling authority of the sovereign, Charles delivered his verdict. Utilizing his unilateral constitutional power over the privy purse and royal domains, he instantly severed her access to all unofficial funds. He ordered a deeply classified, sweeping internal review of every charity and patronage bearing her name. Her shadow empire was dead. Stripped of her leverage and her dignity, Camilla was quietly dismissed from the room. As the heavy doors closed behind her, Charles buried his face in his hands, leaving the king and his sister alone in the devastating wreckage of the crown's most closely guarded secret. The grand, tragic irony of Queen Camilla's shadow empire is that her ultimate downfall was entirely self-inflicted. She spent years meticulously building an elaborate, multi-million-pound shield because she was terrified of being pushed aside by the institution. Yet, the very act of constructing that shield and her ruthless attempt to protect it was exactly what provided the evidence to destroy her. Had she done absolutely nothing when Andrew Parker Bowles first walked into Buckingham Palace, Princess Anne's investigation would have inevitably stalled. The offshore firewalls were simply too strong, and the paper trail too thin. But Camilla's insatiable need for control and her panicked decision to actively frame her ex-husband handed the Princess Royal the one weapon she lacked: a recorded, undeniable confession. While the palace machinery immediately closed ranks, quietly restructuring the crown's finances and burying the scandal deep within classified internal audits, the psychological damage was irreversible. The crisis never reached the British public, but the trust at the heart of the monarchy was permanently shattered. In the end, the contrast between the two women defined the entire crisis. One frantically built a towering fortress of lies until it collapsed under its own weight, while the other quietly and patiently waited for the truth. Camilla had spent decades fighting to secure her place on the throne, only to lock herself inside a cage of her own making.